Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Vivid Voltage, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using the code Omnipoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going over the OP League. We are 8 rounds in, we're actually going through most of round 9 where we've begun Vivid Voltage. But that means that we can look back at the previous meta and actually give you guys the results that we've had from, a pretty high number of games, to be honest. So this is going to be looking at how the players themselves are doing, but also looking at the decks as well, similar to last time.
Yeah, there was around, when I was doing the stats yesterday, there was around, I think, 340 games in total played. So that's a pretty big chunk of data. Obviously, there's been, I think, over 40 or maybe 40 different decks played across a span of eight weeks overall. So obviously, the meta has shifted as the weeks have gone on anyway. But we now have, like you say, more of a clear picture of exactly what the best decks were in terms of win rate, as well as popularity in the Darkness Ablaze and sort of Champions Path included format, as it was all sort of lumped into one. But first things first, let's look at the current league table. Obviously, we're still in the early stages. Things are moving around still quite frequently, but as the games go on and as the weeks go on, the things move or things slow down in terms of movement. So the gaps do begin to sort of get a bit closer in certain aspects, especially at the top. You can see it's really tight at the top with Plus Power, Azul, and Joe all very close to that 20-point mark. So still only 1 week in it. Those kind of gaps, as you can see, will get sort of closer, and you'll see more sort of narrow victories and more margins appearing, which is interesting. But yeah, so this is the updated after 8 weeks the table, which I will also throw on all of the social media at the end of the day as well. So you can see there's been a bit of movement. Obviously, we've had some wins, some losses, still a lot of movement going on. And yeah, I think everyone's sort of no one feels super safe. There's still, it can all change in like 2 weeks, and all of a sudden you can zoom up or you can drop down pretty frantically still. So it's still very sort of erratic how the points are working, which is pretty exciting, I think.
Yeah, and I think one thing to bear in mind is that people can be better in different metas as well. So someone who hasn't really stuck to a deck or something, or didn't really have anything that clicked for them in these first few rounds, it could all change for them. They could, get on well with like maybe some of the new Snorlax plus VMAX based archetypes, or maybe they found a new rogue deck that they like from the new set, and it could completely change, their next few rounds going ahead, because it could just click for them and it's going to be like much better as they go. So yeah, still quite tight in there. I think the most impressive thing is Plus Pout obviously being first, but his game difference has been absolutely insane. And
Yeah.
if we look down to the next graphic, which shows the 2-0 wins compared to 2-1 victories or 1-2 losses, like he's done very well to just win 2-0 swiftly in almost every situation, and his only loss has been a 1-2 loss, so he was still able to claim a point. So really ruthlessly efficient from him, to be honest. That's such good conversion that you can see why he's on top, and it's hard to match that score for anyone. But
Yeah.
he's really been doing well so far in the league.
Definitely. And this sort of 2-0 wins and 2-1 wins was a suggestion from the last video. So make sure if there's any other suggestions you have for some of these stats, every time we do one of these, I want to try and improve them and make them look a little bit better. So I'm always taking on your guys' feedback. So feel free to leave anything down below that you'd like to see. As you can see, this kind of separates where people are winning 2-0 and where people are winning 2-1. Obviously, 2-0 and 2-1 reward the same amount of points for the victor. So it doesn't really change too much there, but it's still good to see kind of where people are winning 2-0, where people are maybe dropping games, and also on the inverse, where people are still frequently picking up points in these losses, because that's still very important. Sometimes just netting a point in a week can be enough to keep you in the game, keep the points moving, and that's what's really important. That's why we didn't want to completely sort of alienate a loss. We wanted to add some points, some incentive to try and at least take one game, even if you feel like the series isn't going your way. So yeah, really interesting stuff to look at. But yeah, one final quick look at how the table is doing overall. And yeah, it's still really exciting. And obviously, as we mentioned at the start, we're moving into the Vivid Voltage meta now. So we can look back at the decks that we had of the last meta, and we will be able to then, hopefully in a few weeks' time, look at how the meta changes with a whole new set of cards. But once again, we have decks ranked on their win rate, and then also in comparatively the amount of games they've had played. Obviously, because some of these 100% win rates, there's only been 1 or 2 games played, so maybe slightly skewing the data. So that's why it's also very good to compare how many games each of these decks have played as well. So you have a real good idea of what the strongest contenders are, as well as the most popular decks in the meta right now.
Yeah, I think what's really cool is because we've gone over like 8 weeks, you actually get a good snapshot of how the meta progressed, because you can see how few games Pikarom actually had compared to like where you'd expect it now. It was like, I think, the second most popular deck in the Players Cup 2,
Mhm.
because it was just like a lot of people wrote it off just because the two VMAXs from Darkness Ablaze could so easily like one bomb it, and then it was just those adaptations from Pikarom that made it, even more defensive in some regard by adding in Crushing Hammers and sometimes even Yell Grunts on top of that, and maining like double stamp, sometimes even triple stamp. So it took a while. It almost like took a small hiatus and then really like came back strong in the latter stages of the meta. So its games played were quite low, but you can see its win rate was actually quite strong because people only started playing it again when there was confidence again in the deck, which was pretty cool to see. Baby Blacephalon with I think one of the highest win rates of at least the decks that has had a decent number of games out there, and we have some Blacephalon specialists in our league, so that certainly does help that win rate. But I think it's a surprise really because I feel like Baby Blacephalon never really is like in people's top tier. Whenever you see tier lists or discussion or anything like that, there's people who swear by Blacephalon, and then there's tons of people that will just completely ignore it. But it seems to have been very effective for those who have taken it into these league games, which is really cool to see. The top decks that we sort of come to know at the start, ADPization, pretty much everyone is bringing that, to be honest, because it's kind of, for me, it's like a no-brainer to bring ADP, because especially when you lose a game, choosing to go first with ADP is like an insane win rate. I think when I did my 100 games of series, ADP going first won like 80% of the time across the board. And that's like even queuing into opposing welder decks that say like, I'd like to go second anyway. So, I mean, ADP is just still crazy. I think especially when you get to choose to go... Like, that's been my tactic the entire time. I've very rarely queued ADPZ as my first deck, and then I've always kept it for if I lose my first game, which I've done a lot. So I feel like I can bounce back immediately by just going like, well, ADP gets me the win because I'm going first with ADP, and then we go into a game 3 situation and let's see what happens kind of thing. And that's also why I often bring a welder deck. This is just like a personal thing that I like to do. I like to bring ADP and a welder deck, so I have more control over my win rate based on going first and second, which is like a really big deal. But yeah, the ADP, Eternatus, and Senti, they don't have the most impressive win rates, but do bear in mind that they'll be facing off against each other quite a lot in mirror matches, which is one thing, and they're also obviously very expected decks. So sometimes people are counter queuing, sometimes people... I mean, every deck list in general has to be prepared for those archetypes. Just that's the way a meta shapes, essentially. So you can't really go into your game week thinking that you can't beat ADP or Eternatus because it's just not going to work out well for you. So that's something keeping their win rates relatively low, but I would still put them as like some of the best decks despite their win rates not being that high. Eternatus seems to have fallen off a little bit though, from what I've seen. I think it did relatively well in Players Cup 2, but I don't think it was... I think it really fell off for a lot of people. People jumped to the poison builds. I think Straight Eternatus kind of fell off a cliff in the latter stages of this meta.
Yeah, I think the other thing is, like you say, the kind of on the counter to that, I feel like Center Scorch has sort of seen a bit of a resurgence lately as well. Center Scorch is kind of... Initially, I think we were both pretty unimpressed with it. It was really impressive in our sort of tabletop sim testing, and when we both jumped onto PTCGO, it didn't really gel with either of us. But I think at least for the past couple of weeks, I've been rocking Center Scorch and I've really enjoyed it. And I feel like I've been seeing less people playing it recently, but it doing better from a couple of the results I've been looking at. So in general, it feels like those two, the gap between Eternatus and Center Scorch is really closed recently. And I think you can tell that with the games played. You can see like ADP is head and shoulders with games played above every other deck. But like as you said, basically everyone is queuing it as one of their 3 decks because it is so strong. It's by far one of the most expected decks. But at the same time, I feel like things like Eternus and Sense Scorch, there's not many people that bring all 3 of those. They'll typically bring maybe ADP in one of those 2, and then something a little bit more off piece, like an Inteleon, a Baby Blounds, a Picaron, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff. And I think the gap between Eternus and Sense Scorch, I need to look back on the stats to be 100% sure of that, but I feel like the gap is closing between those 2. But yeah, looking down, there are a couple of other interesting archetypes. Obviously, a lot of these will only have been played once or twice, but it's still interesting to look at them. Baby Blounds, like you said, one of the highest win rates in the top 10. Welder Mewtwo, one of the lowest, which is interesting. I feel like Welder Mewtwo is another one that had a real uptick around midway through this first sort of bracket of our league, and then all of a sudden with Pika Mew and that kind of thing, it's kind of vanished a little bit to an extent.
Sorry, I'm trying to fix my camera. But carry on.
Then things like Control and Decigoons were quite popular at the start of the league, and I feel like I've seen a lot less of Control, Decidueye, Goons, Decigoons, that kind of thing recently as well. So, like you say, it really shows a progression over the past few weeks of how the meta has changed. Obviously, you have to take into account that people will just want to play something new, something different, that kind of thing. But yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff. Another one is Magneton Senti. Obviously, that saw massive hype when Tord posted his list and did a lot of streams on it. But there was actually, I think all 3 of those games were accounted for in the same week, and then no one played it after that. So yeah, really interesting stuff. How the meta changes. Same with Pika Mew. There was obviously that deck only appeared last week, but then 2 people brought it this week. So yeah, you can see how the data kind of skews a little bit as you get to these lower played games. You can see that the data is very polarizing, and that's typically because you don't have a lot of data on these games. But that's still really interesting to see how new decks are brought, that kind of thing. I also want to, at least hopefully for the next series of stats, show kind of the progression through the weeks of the popularity of decks. I'm going to try and work on that, work out how best I can show that, so we can actually really truly see whether ADP was more popular in the early weeks and then it kind of dropped off and was just people's backup pick, or whether it turned out that people really wanted to be anti-ADP at the start of the first few weeks of the league, and then by the time week 8 came, everyone was like, yeah, well, ADP is so good, let's just lock it in, let's have it in the back pocket and be able to play ADP because the win rate is so high. So yeah, that's the next progression of these stats. Obviously, this spreadsheet is absolutely massive at the moment, so it takes a long time to edit things. But that's ideally what my next progression is going to be with the stats.
Yeah, maybe some like week by week line graphs of popularity.
Yeah,
that's the only way I could think it being, and then you color the different lines for at least like maybe the top 10. It would get messy if you get too many on there.
Yeah, all of these. But yeah, I'd like to do basically at least the 10th place cutoff is a really nice cutoff because that's 10 games played.
Yeah.
With Control, I'm pretty sure almost all of them have been by Alessandro, to be fair.
Yeah, almost. Yeah.
But yeah, so I think that'd be a really nice position to point off. Looking at the top 10 decks and how their progression is over each week. At least this is all for Darkness Ablaze and Champion's Path. I will be starting new stats for Vivid Voltage, so this will be completely wiped, but I will also do a cumulative of the whole season. Not that it kind of shows anything because metas change and that kind of thing, but
Sure.
more out of interest than anything. I want to know how many games across a whole season ADP has played for. But yeah, there will be, so the next time you see these stats, they will be completely wiped and will be in terms of Vivid Voltage. And also I will hopefully include some of the other sort of special format stats. I didn't include the theme deck ones because typically the scope of the theme decks is kind of limited because there's only a handful of theme decks that are really competitive. But our next format is likely to be single prize attackers. And with single prize attackers, the options are basically endless. There's so many single prize attackers that get so much better when things like ADP are banned. That's gonna really be a much better sort of representation, I think, of some different decks. So that's the kind of stats that I want to show as well. The theme decks, like I say, I don't think it was too interesting because basically it was just Dragonite theme deck mirrors. But things like the single prize attackers, I think we could see some really creative results from. So yeah, definitely stay tuned to look out for that week in the next few weeks as well, because I'm really excited for that one.
And just before we go, just a random bit of speculation from us. Really, are there any other decks that you think that are currently in the top 10 that you think are going to be played a lot less in the new meta? Are there any that you're thinking will be particularly played a lot more? It's always strange when we have this situation where once someone's won with a deck, it's almost because you know it's then locked. You can sometimes still bring decks with auto losses. That's quite different to
Yeah.
locking into a tournament, for example. But do you think there'll be any that are, I don't know, maybe in the top 20 right now that are going to make a big resurgence or a push going forward?
So I think the top four are probably, I think, fairly likely to stick around. Eternatus's win rate will probably drop just because of the natural progression of Colossal into the meta. Whether Colossal has a good win rate itself, um, it kind of doesn't matter. I think that may scare Eternatus off a little bit. Similarly with Pikarom, I wouldn't expect Pikarom to go up, but I don't think it'll go down either. I think it's pretty self-sustaining in around that seventh place spot.
Mm-hmm.
Inteleon is an interesting one because I feel like nothing really changes except it gets scope, but I'm still very surprised to see Inteleon as the fifth most played deck.
Yeah.
So Inteleon for me is the big sort of elephant in the room as to whether that's going to go up or down. Are people really, really big fanboys of Inteleon, or is it a lot of the Inteleon games were at the start of the league? Again, they tied in a lot with when some big players were posting about Inteleon. People
Sure.
like Azul, Tord, both did Inteleon lists within the same week. So there will be a lot of that behind it. So that'll be interesting to see whether that drops down to where I would expect sort of a 12th, 13th place list to be. Excadrill, I think, will probably see a lot less play simply because I think Colossal will become the fighting deck of choice.
Mm-hmm.
I think Excadrill has its own merits for sure, but I think Colossal, just through new set hype as well, will likely be the fighting deck of choice. And similarly with Control, I expect Control to maybe drop a little bit just for the first few weeks, simply because Control typically does well in an established meta, and the meta has to take time to work out exactly how the control lists need to be built. So I don't think the format is any worse for Control. I just think as a deck that evolves, I think Control takes a little bit longer than these other decks, simply because there's less people piloting it, so there's less sort of communal minds working on the perfect 60 as opposed to like an ADP where everyone is. But also the intricacies between techs in a control list, I feel, are always a little bit more thought about than some of the attacking decks. So I expect things like Execute and Control, I think, will drop a little bit, but I wouldn't expect them to go anywhere. So yeah, that's for the current meta. I'd be interested to hear what you think in terms of new decks will be popping into the top 20 or even the top 10 in the next few weeks.
Well, I think there's a lot of interest around Orbital, so I'd expect that to be popular early on.
Mhm.
I don't actually see much hype around Colossal. I think it may be one of those things that people bring it as their third choice deck and then never actually play with the deck. I don't know. I've seen more people feel like it's a flop than it's like actually really solid.
Yeah.
So it may be like the first few weeks people are off Colossal, and then we see that Pikarom and well, Pikarom and a couple other like Eternatus and stuff like that, if they're still being brought frequently, then it could, actually be a good pick again. So I think Colossal's also like kind of on the back burner for now. I think really it's the Whimsicott deck that I think I'm interested to see how its impacts, what sort of impact it's going to have. There's not much Mewtwo in the top 10 right now, but Whimsicott can pretty much just style on it quite aggressively.
Mhm.
I think it's also got a very good Pikarom because you can one-bop the Pikaroms, which is really good. And obviously you're going to play Mew and stuff like that. I played it this week, and I added the Mimikyu that stops healing into the deck, and I think that helps the Luke Metal matchup a lot as well. So I think it's kind of well-rounded. I think it probably will sit in the top 10 for popularity, just because I know Azul's been perfecting that list on his stream like all week, essentially. So I think there's a lot of eyes on it. I think there's a lot of attention brought to it, and I think it's like warranted. It can have quite a rough early game because you need to find so many Pokemon and so many tools. But other than just like Marnie's, which is not even in like all of the top 10 decks because there's a few welder decks in there and stuff like that, it can just churn and burn by being a one prizer and get through a lot of these matchups. And I think its type coverage is actually like quite helpful to it as well. So yeah, I'm excited to see where that ends up. I think it's important to have something that can check baby blounds as well, because I'm still not
Yes.
certain that we have much in the format to check baby blounds. Like maybe a small uptick in Inteleon hurts its win rate as well. But at the moment, baby blounds seems like a no-brainer. If Luke Metal's pretty much the deck that's going to see, it's already in the top four, but I think more people have an incentive to bring it now because it just, in theory, gets stronger in a vacuum. And it did well in Players Cup 2 again. There's no reason not to bring Baby Blounds unless you just like don't get on with the deck, which some people don't, which is fair enough. But it's going to be cool to see if the Whimsicott archetype actually makes a splash, or if it's just going to be like me and Azul playing it and everyone else ignoring us. That'll be fun to see.
Yeah, I've been impressed with the deck so far. I think it's probably. I think obviously we've rated it fairly highly, but I think even still, it's one of my most underrated cards for the set because I thought it would be a good one prize attacker, but I didn't think it would be as good as it is.
Yeah.
So it's going to be really interesting to see the progression of that deck. And like you say, I know Azul has been perfecting it, and I know you're a fan as well. So even if it's just you two, that's probably still gonna, at least for the first batch of results in a few weeks' time, that would probably still like propel it into the at least top 20, probably top 10
Mm-hmm.
off the back of you two anyway. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether there's anything else pop up. I'm not sure whether I'm going to lump all of the Orbital variants together or whether people will specify specific things that they're playing it with. We'll have to
Mm-hmm.
wait and see how people report results.
Yeah.
But yeah, it could be one of those things where kind of Orbital ends up being second or third, but that's just because everyone's playing 5 different variants of Orbital. So we'll have to wait and see how the results come in regarding that. But yeah, it's going to be pretty interesting, and I'm pretty excited to see how this meta shifts based on a whole new set coming out. Because obviously, Champions Path only really introduced 2 or 3 new cards that were actually changed the meta at all. So it'll be interesting to see. This is the first real new big meta shift of the league, so that's going to be very exciting indeed.
Yeah. Well, very good stuff all round. I'm excited to be playing in the new format as well. So it's definitely a good chance if you haven't watched some of the league games for a few weeks. This is the time to be watching the league. I think it's all well and good trying to follow your favorites throughout, but we all know this developed meta at this point, and now that Vivid Voltage is coming, there's like so much more reason to watch the gameplay because you're learning so much more throughout, and you're seeing everyone's different perspectives on what they think is going to be good, what they're targeting, what they're continuing to bring from the current decks, and what they're risking in terms of what new decks they've sort of they believe will give them a good chance to win. So I think that's going to be an interesting balance. Everyone has their own different thoughts about the meta and what's safe and what's risky and all that sort of thing. So it's going to be cool to see different variations of those deck lists from each different content creator. Especially those that there's a lot of content creators that are sort of known for doing a deck list every single week or every single day in some cases, and there are some that focus on other things, but also seeing how their deck building process works early on in a meta and then how that adapts is also going to be an interesting sort of case study to follow. So I'm really looking forward to watch gameplay as well. So hopefully you guys do also. But
Yeah, it's gonna be a lot of fun.
yeah, that rounds everything up quite nicely. I think that's week 8 of the league, the update. Most people have, well, a good amount of us have already had our first game of Vivid Voltage. Myself and Jack have finished our games. Jack's video is still to go up, which is going to be in a day or two. And then, then we'll be moving on to week 10 and still plugging away at those league positions. Jack's raised up a little bit. I've gone down a little bit, but
the gap is closing. the gap is closing.
But yeah.
Maybe it'll be even closer this time in a few weeks' time. We'll have to wait and see.
All right. Well, cheers for watching, guys, and we'll see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.